happy to be here. Hello. So today I'm going to talk to you about a medicine you may not have heard about, because it's not a medicine that is on the British pharmaceutical market, but I see we have a diverse crowd today, so maybe you will know about it. So what's wrong with this medicine? Well, it's extremely popular in the French pharmaceutical landscape, as I will show. But one main issue is the lack of scientific evidence in its favor. And so I wrote, this talk is going to be based on a book I wrote in French. And I wrote it in French, well, because it's about French medicine, but also because I wanted the book to have an impact on the public debate about this drug. And so the book is a little bit of a mixed bag. It's you may be familiar with agnotology, the study of ignorance, and how ignorance, let's say the lack of knowledge, knowledge that should be there but is not, it was built historically. It's also a piece of feminist philosophy and history of medicine, a little bit of standpoint epistemology. You will see it at the end. But it's also a book that was written for a general audience as well. So I explain a lot about the basic of philosophy of medicine and medical ethics. So let's jump in. What is this drug? So this drug is called Spasfon. I forgot to bring a box to you. No, but there is a reasonable reason is I live in Belgium and it's also not on the Belgian market, so I cannot buy it. Well, also I don't want to give my money for that drug. And so as you can see, the drug is not always, but very often presented in this pink ring. So I'm first going to explain to you what is Spasfon, because I'm aware nobody knows what it is. I will also mention the state of evidence about Spasfon. Obviously, I cannot be exhaustive. I can just tell you that hopefully I will have a paper forthcoming that talks, that is more exhaustive about this. Then there will be a history part in this talk, where I will talk about the troubled and dark history behind the making of this drug. Then I will mention, I will walk you through what others have called the regulatory impotence. So it's like the health authorities and their lack of action regarding the lack of evidence for that drug. Then I'm going to make a quick and small ethical arguments about why I think the current situation in France with this drug is a huge problem. And then I will not explain right now what it means, but I want to take seriously the fact that I knew that the drug does not work, as many other French women. So well, that will be the more philosophical part of the work of today's talk. Okay, so what is Spasfon? So the molecule name is phloroglucinol, and it is claimed to be an antispasmodic thanks to smooth muscle relaxing properties. And ANSM is the French medical agency, so they do consider it as such. And it is used as a painkiller, and it is reimbursed by the health insurance around 50%. So it is used for urinary, gastrointestinal pains, but also gynecological pains, and for contraction during pregnancy. It's also prescribed for biliary pains, but not reimbursed for that indication. So the drug was created in France, as I will explain, and it's not in the UK, it's not in the United States, Canada, Germany, but it is available on a few markets. I cannot be exhaustive about it, but in Italy, most French colonies in Africa, sorry, but I say former French colonies in Africa. Sorry, I must say that I didn't sleep really well last night. But actually, so I really want to give a translational direction for this research, and I would be very interested to see the consequence of colonialism on the drug journey beyond France. And interestingly, also the drug is in South Korea, Pakistan, and maybe, but it was not very clear to me, I was not able to access the government database, but also in China. And like I said, it's not exhaustive. And if there are chemists here, this is the molecule there. It is a very simple molecule. Okay. Those are the different pharmaceutical companies that sold the drug. Laboratoire Lafon, we will talk about this. Then an American firm called Spasfon, and then nowadays Teva. So now a bit of numbers, and here you need to focus because those are huge numbers. In 2012 and 2013, in France, Spasfon was the 5th most sold drugs in the country. For comparison, ibuprofen was the 21st most sold drug. It's also heavily prescribed. So in 2021, for example, 25.3 million units of phloroglucinol, meaning boxes, have been prescribed in France, and it continues to grow. And most importantly for me, there is a big gender ratio in how it is prescribed. For the age group 18-59, 75% of this drug, Spasfon, is prescribed to women, and this continues over the age of 59. And also, it's important to note for later that this drug is heavily prescribed to pregnant persons. Those are the images you will find if you try to look for stock pictures for Spasfon, which reflects the gender ratio that I just mentioned. Okay, so now about the lack of evidence in favor of this drug. You may think, wait, it's the 5th most sold drug in the country. It must have scientific evidence. Well, it does not. For instance, in this paper, some medical professional published, I don't know, it's like a joke. Apparently, this drug can be used to remove stains from hospital blues. And so they made a paper to prove this, and they called it an evidence-based indication for injectable phloroglucinol. So it's like an open secret among health professionals, but the public is not necessarily aware of this. So now one French team tried to alert about the lack of evidence about the drug. In 2018, 2020, they published 2 systematic reviews. So systematic reviews is going to collect and see all the randomized controlled trials about a drug for different indication. So the first review tried to look it up for abdominal pain, and then the second one was about gynecological pain. So stuff like menstrual pain. So the conclusion of these 2 systematic reviews is there is not enough scientific evidence for this drug. But a more worrying problem is that there is almost no randomized controlled trials, for instance. So for instance, in 2024, doesn't exist. There is no randomized controlled trial about using Spasfon for menstrual pain. There is just no evidence. And yet, it's a very, very common indication for the drug. So here, it's a little bit hard for me to explain to you, but when I was a teenager, saying, do you have a Spasfon, was a shorthand to say, I have my period. So this is a heavily it's a cultural phenomenon that in France, when we have our period or anything weird happening here, we don't think we want ibuprofen or acetaminophen, we want Spasfon because we have spasm. That's what we believe as a culture. Yeah, so there was, in this first systematic review, there was one RCT done on IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. That is probably the best RCT that was published on phloroglucinol. And when I published the book in 2023, so last year, it was the only RCT that Teva Pharmaceutical published. They published a press release, and it was the only RCT they mentioned. And I will explain it. We'll go through a little bit more through this trial. So in all of this data, there is methodological issues. I will give one example. Big problem is that the best evidence are all published by pharmaceutical companies that have a stake in finding evidence about the drug efficacy. There is, of course, the risk of non-published negative results. So I understand you're not familiar with philosophy of medicine, so I'm going to explain. There is a phenomenon called publication bias in scientific research, but especially medical research, where we tend to publish positive evidence, positive results. And the problem is then we overestimate the efficacy of pharmaceutical drugs because the negative results don't get to be published and taken into account. And I was able to at least prove that was at least one randomized control trial that did not lead to the publication of the results. And there's also a big problem around the fact that many studies in China are not translated. So it's not even possible to access that evidence. And I'm not able to tell you whether it's good or not, because it's not just translated in English. So that's why I was telling you that one step I see myself in the future taking is trying to be more transnational and trying to see what's going on, for instance, in China with this drug. Okay. So I talked about the lack of clinical evidence, but there is also not much or no mechanistic evidence. So usually in evidence-based medicine, we don't really care anyway about medical mechanistic evidence. But it's still interesting to talk about this because the health authorities, the health professionals, and a lot of people in France really believe the drugs to be antispasmodic. So they are really convinced by this mechanistic story. And the problem is, as far as I could tell, like I tried really hard to look for it, there is no mechanistic evidence. There is no way to, there is nothing that says that phloroglucinol is actually antispasmodic. So maybe it is not antispasmodic at all. So let's talk quickly about the best maybe study about Spasfon, which is this RCT published in 2007 by Spasfon at the time, and it was done on the question of whether phloroglucinol is useful in treating IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome. This RCT led the health authorities to raise the reimbursement rate of Spasfon in 2008, and then they changed their mind again. So I'm not going to go too much into the detail, but they conclude that the relative risk, meaning the how likely the drug is efficient, is 11%. And they say at least a 10% difference is usually considered as clinically relevant. And they say that because they rely on this consensus report published in 2003 on how we should conduct clinical research for IBS. But there is a trick. So they used the 10% difference that is suggested as a guide by this consensus report. But then they follow none of the advice that we can read in this consensus report. So the report recommended a 2 weeks baseline observation period. The paper did none. The study only lasted 1 week, when the consensus report recommended to do 1 to 3 months, 1 to 3 months trial, and they did no follow-up period with no active treatment. And there was also some other issues. So this was just to give you a striking example of the fact that even the best study is lacking methodologically. So the question I had in my book was, where did Spasfon come from? How did Spasfon become so successful despite the lack of evidence in its favor? So in agnotology, we would say, how did this lack of evidence, ignorance, was created, and how did it maintain itself to this day? And one question I had, of course, was sexism one of the causes of this ignorance? And finally, because this book was aimed to change or to open a public debate about the drug, I also wanted to ask whether this situation is harming the population. So now the history of Spasfon. So these papers were extremely difficult to track. And when I finally tracked them, that's the moment when I thought, I really need to do a whole chapter about the history of the drug. So in 1961, there was first a therapeutic study, a clinical study, if you will. Then later on, animal studies and toxicity studies. And finally, in 1964, the drug was introduced to the French market. So obviously, it's a little bit weird that they did the human study before the non-human animal study, but let's not say anything about that for now, because there is lost. So this paper was absolutely incredible to read for many reasons. First, we learned that using phloroglucinol in medicine was inspired by herbalism, because a researcher thought the phloroglucinol, the molecule, looked a little bit like lime tree bark. And they explain lime tree bark, tilia, is very useful to treat biliary pains and what they called at the time digestive migraines. So I couldn't really go a lot into what it meant at the time. But basically, at first, phloroglucinol was not an antispasmodic. It was supposed to act, because it was like the bark of tilia, to act on bile flow. And so to act on migraines, liver attacks, biliary pains, knowing that all of these don't really exist nowadays anymore. They were really specific illness of the time. And I will tell you a little bit more about that later. And most importantly, the paper revealed that in 1961, the human experimentation was quite unethical, and it involved poisoning women. They also tested the drug for renal colic. And the paper just relates 14 patients in total, 14 cases, 10 women and 4 men. I found pictures of the Bichat Hospital where the research was conducted in the archives. So I thought it was interesting that they were already in colors. But apparently it's the start of the 60s is when we started doing pictures in colors. But anyway. So what happened? So the year before at the hospital, they published a paper where they realized that if you inject patients, they don't explain how they realized that, but if you inject patients with morphine and I never know how to pronounce it, but cholinergic or cholinergic, sorry. If you inject both at the same time to a patient, he is going to feel symptoms and pain that are going to resemble what I call digestive migraines liver attacks, and so on. And in the paper, they describe doing this twice. I'm going to show you an example. I'm sorry to say it's not very funny, but they did it twice. First, they did what they call the choleretic morphine trial. Then they give phloroglucinol to see if it works. And then they did a second time to test the drug as a prevention drug. They give the drug, phloroglucinol, then they inject the product to the patient to see if they're going to have symptoms or not. We don't know on how many, I don't know how many people they did that. They only report 6 cases, 4 women and 2 men. And one example is given as a failure, but I will not read that example to you because it's really upsetting. And the rationale for the experimental design is we wanted to avoid as much as possible the subjectivity of the therapeutic judgment. I should give you a little bit of context, maybe. In the 60s, sure, in the UK, you already did randomized control trial, but this was not fully accepted everywhere, and especially not in France. So either they didn't know about it or they didn't care, but it's not very surprising that they didn't do for sure a randomized control trial. It's a little bit more strange that they would do this, for sure. What they would usually do is like what they do in the rest of the paper, which is just giving the drugs to patients and see if it works on a small number of people. Okay. So this is one successful example. So this at the hospital in Paris, Antonine, 40 years old. On the 21st of October, 1960, the choleretic morphinic challenge is performed. The pain is such that the patient has to curl up in a fetal position in her bed. 40 minutes after the appearance of the painful phenomena, we give the patient 6 pills of phloroglucinol, and 15 minutes later, the pain intensity has considerably decreased. Okay, I have to say that I'm currently working on on a paper with a specialist, with an expert on the ethics and the history of the ethics of human experimentation in France. So here are some ideas about what happened. So we know that until the 1980s in France, anything was okay to do, permissible to do in human experimentation if the goal of the experimentation is to cure, to heal. And we also know that actually we don't know much about it. Post-Second World War, we don't know much about what happened. One reason is a lot of these medical papers, I said it was difficult to track because they have not been digitalized. So you have to be lucky that they are in a university library somewhere. Okay, one problem with this is that even though the paper, the 1961 paper is called the first therapeutic use of phloroglucinol, the trial, the choleretic morphinic trial, is obviously not therapeutic. It's hard to, it sounds absurd to say, I'm going to trigger pains in you for therapeutic purposes. And yet, so the paper was published. It was also presented in a public session of the Société Française de Thérapeutique et de Pharmacodynamie. So it's very strange. How is it possible that this happened? And I have 2 explanations that may be both true. So the authors managed to make the experiment look therapeutic enough, so that would just be the title, basically. Or maybe they convinced people that it was a diagnostic test, maybe. So if we are able to trigger these digestive migraines in patients, is to diagnose them, maybe. Another possibility is that maybe we have underestimated the scale of human experimentation in France, and that maybe a lot was permissible even when the goal was not therapeutic. And I will not talk about it today, but actually I found papers that do that are much more later than the 60s. So I think it's possible that we have underestimated the scale of human experimentation. Okay, now a little bit more about bile and spasm. So in this first paper, the mechanistic story was that it's going to act on the bile flow in the body. So liver attacks, they were described in the 19th century in France by a doctor called Trousseau, and they were explicitly considered as more prevalent among women. So it's not surprising that this 1961 paper had enrolled more women than men in it. Anthropologist Puchel, in 2007, she suggested that this whole liver-attacked, biliary pain, digestive migraines, so they all are a little bit of the same disease category of the time. They were a little bit like the successor of hysteria, but in the 20th century. And indeed, if you read a little bit about hysteria in the 19th century, so for instance, Brachet, Traité de l'hystérie, he writes the following. So it is not surprising that people have always tried to stop them, the spasm caused by hysteria, and that they have put a great deal of faith in antispasmodic. Their vogue is not a passing one, but a reign of many centuries, which for me was really strange to read, because it's like a little bit like Brachet predicted the future a little bit here. Because indeed, antispasmodic Spasfon is still at the top of the pharmaceutical landscape in France. And I don't know about other countries. I also wanted to show you this citation, quote. It's from a 1917 manual of pharmacology published by Solman, and it is cited by Laboratoire Lafond pharmacologist Caron in 1962 in the paper where he explains that phloroglucinol is not going to act on the bile, but it's more likely to be an antispasmodic. It says that phloroglucin is practically inactive. This is important because in the construction of ignorance, sometimes it's not so much that we don't create, we fail to create knowledge, that sometimes knowledge was a little bit there, but we decided to ignore it or we forgot about it. So in 1917, we already knew it did nothing, but they chose to ignore all that. Okay, so how did Spasfon ended up on the market? It's not very surprising because, so at the time, there was a administrative procedure to introduce drugs on the market called visa. The visa, after there was a scandal in the 50s, and after that, the visa really was supposed to evaluate the safety and the efficacy of pharmaceuticals, but this was the job of the company applying. So the administrative authorities were just, they didn't have any powers, if you want. So what happened is normal for the time. And unfortunately, the archives of the health authorities are, how should I say, incomplete. So we only have the summary of the application for Spasfon. We don't have the documents that were submitted for the application. So what does the summary says about this application? So they had two experts. One of them was actually a co-author of the study I described before. So you had two experts, and I'm sorry there is a spelling mistake. One worked on whether Spasfon was efficient for biliary pain on 17 patients, and one did a study on 62 patients for renal colic. Then they both mentioned that they also tried the drug on a painful period, dysmenorrhea. So one expert, for instance, mentioned the following: Spasfon has revealed itself to be an efficient drug for menstrual pain. On 9 observations of dysmenorrhea, the expert observed 1 negative result. And then the second expert tested Spasfon, but on just 1 woman. And then in the visa, they say, okay, the drug is going to be approved for, and the first indication is dysmenorrhea. So obviously my problem is not with how the health authorities were approving drugs at the time. This was pretty standard. But with the fact that dysmenorrhea was clearly just an afterthought, and that the numbers were also, like the evidence was really weak for all the indication, but this was normal. But it was even weaker for menstrual pain. And for me, this is a clear indication that there was a sexist bias in the medical evaluation of the drug. And this is the passage where they explain this, and they forgot to write dysmenorrhea. Okay. But Spasfon, the laboratory of Spasfon didn't stop there. They then later on tried to market the drug for obstetrics. So they were happy with menstrual pain, but they wanted it to be prescribed to pregnant women as well, and during delivery, actually. So for instance, so at the time, medical marketing and scientific communication was basically done by the same people, which was the company. So it's also not very surprising, but this is an example, a quote from this document that I found at the medical library. Thanks to Spasfon, a less unpleasant memory for the mother, a normal birth for the baby, an appreciable time saver for the obstetrician and colleagues. So this was in 1969, before that the drug was approved for this indication in the country. So you can see how the marketing and the company interest was pushing for the introduction on the market for this indication. And indeed, in 1974, they reformed the visa system. It becomes a IMM, market authorization. And then, unfortunately, there is nothing in the archives, so I cannot tell you why, but they added obstetric to the list of indication for Spasfon. Sorry. Yeah, it's interesting also to see that in this list of indication, everything becomes spasmodic. So it's not dysmenorrhea, it's spasmodic dysmenorrhea, it's not delivery or contraction, it's cervix spasm and so on. And it's interesting because, like I said, there is absolutely no mechanistic evidence that it is doing anything for spasm. And also, at that time, they added that morphine should not be prescribed at the same time as Spasfon, which obviously is a huge problem because then you give, for very painful symptoms, you give a drug that is probably useless, but also you don't give a drug that is probably useful, morphine. And it still exists, this contraindication, but when I talked to French doctors, they were not even aware of it, so it's a bit, like I'm not sure it's actually followed today. And the first epidemic safety study on whether it was safe to take during pregnancy was 2011. Luckily, the data is not too worrying, but you can imagine that it could have been catastrophic. And for some other drugs, it was catastrophic. Okay. So was Spasfon made for women? So I argue that yes, for several reasons. First, the studies focused on liver attacks, migraines, and so on, that at the time and for a long time has been believed to be more frequent in women. In the only clinical study of the time, the patients were mostly women, 10 out of 14. And then they doubled down after they added menstrual pain, they also added obstetrics. And there is also the hypothesis, but I think the more historical work should be done to be really sure about this. But there is a possible link between Spasfon and hysteria in the sense of maybe in the 19th century, women suffered from hysteria, but now we have spasm. It's more acceptable in a way. And of course, was the drug pink because of that? I could check that indeed it was pink in 1964, but I cannot tell you that it was pink for women, because it's really right at that moment that pink became really gendered, I don't know what to say, became really used to sell to women, and I cannot prove it. It's possible that it was just a lucky coincidence. Another thing to consider is that Laboratoire Laffen official colors were blue and pink. So it could also be like a coincidence that were very successful in the end. I'm going to drink a bit of water. Okay. Like I mentioned before, ignorance, the construction of ignorance can also be the result of how we lost knowledge. And there is a clear example of that in a report from the Autorité de Santé. So the Autorité de Santé in France is a health authority that decides how much and whether a drug will be reimbursed. So it's not the same as the drug agency that will decide whether it will be on the market or not. And all of these documents from the HAS are public. So it's very interesting to read because you can follow what I would call a willful ignorance from the administration, because they are aware that the evidence is lacking, but they still recommend to reimburse the drug again and again and again. And in the 2008 paper report on this, they mentioned that in 1990, there was apparently a clinical trial done for Spasfon on menstrual pain and pain during IUD insertion. Problem: there is no trace of this study in the literature, so it's probably unpublished data from the pharmaceutical company. And second problem, when I reached out to the health authorities to ask about it, they did not reply. Like I said about the weak, I want to insist that they are aware that the evidence is lacking. So for instance, they will say the methodology of this paper is very dubious. This paper is totally irrelevant. This paper was sent in Chinese and we don't understand it. There is no clinical guidelines saying we should give antispasmodic for menstrual pain, and so on and so on and so on. But they will never, they never take action, meaning they never decide to stop reimbursing the drug. So one hypothesis of why this is happening, in the book, I spent a bit of time on the question of whether there is some kind of epistemic injustice phenomenon, meaning that maybe a lot of women are complaining. Well, we'll say a lot of women are complaining that the drug is not working, but since we are not listening to women, this is allowing to happen. But another thing is, apparently the French health authorities function on a safety, like they only focus on the safeness of drugs, they don't seem to really care whether a drug is effective or not. If it's safe, it's good to go, we can continue. There was a famous case that was recently studied by Josephine Eberhardt, the D-Entalvic drug that was popular in the UK, in France, and a few other European countries. And it was the European Medical agency that forced the countries to remove it from the market because it was not safe. But it's very interesting to read what the health authorities, the French health authorities of the time wrote about this drug, because they basically argued that everybody loved the drug. It doesn't hurt anyone to continue prescribing it. And Eberhard concludes that they are totally uninterested in documenting whether the drug is efficient or not. It's not their problem, basically. And this happened in other cases, like with progestin in France as well. And Louis and Weiss, they write that progestin appeared in most cases to have very few negative effects, and that these were not life-threatening conditions that were where we prescribed this progestin. So it was very easy to prescribe and very difficult to remove from the market, basically. And of course, the problem is how can the balance between risk and benefits be positive if there is no proven benefit? It's just not possible. And another more legal problem is that the official French health authorities' missions are to evaluate the effectiveness and risk of medication, not just the risk. So it's absurd philosophically, but it's also absurd legally. Okay, and there's a worrying like this trend among the, I don't know. I want to hypothesize that the French health authorities think like this because they refuse to talk to me, so I don't know exactly how they think. But this also applies when there is uncertainty on safety. Yeah, because I should have mentioned that, in fact, it's true that for most people, the drug has almost no side effects. The counter examples are very bad, very rare allergy effects. Okay, but what about pregnancy? Well, in 2020, there was a task force at the health authorities, NSM, that looked at it. So there was a huge cohort of pregnant women, and almost 23% of these women were prescribed the drug. And they saw in the data that in fact, the babies that were exposed to phloroglucinol have an increased risk of major deformity. And then you can read, it's public, the discussion between the task force, and they're like, this is a bit strange, maybe not everyone that is prescribed phloroglucinol take it, and maybe some people take it without being prescribed it because it's out over the counter. So basically, we cannot really trust this data. So they said we should redo the calculus. And the way they did it, it's just redid the statistical analysis for the first 10 weeks of the pregnancy. And when you do that, in fact, indeed, apparently there is no more statistical significance about the risk of major deformity. But it's only in this second meeting that you can read in the discussion that some of the members said, but we don't really have evidence that we should give this drug to pregnant women in the first place. And then they are a little bit confused, and they're like, yeah, but the NSM did approve it, so we can't really do anything. And then the discussion was closed. So even when there is uncertainty on safety, the lack of evidence, the uncertainty on efficacy is not really important for the health authorities. Okay. What should we conclude about the lack of evidence about Spasfon? You may be familiar with the saying that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning that, yes, there is almost no clinical data about this drug, but maybe it works. It's just that we didn't do the study, we didn't publish them. First of all, in most cases, this is not true. For instance, if I go outside now, I cannot see outside, but and I look around, it's not raining, I can conclude that it's not raining. Okay. Of course, if I refuse to go outside and I hide my eyes, I cannot conclude that it's not raining. But if I'm trying actively to figure out whether it rains, then I can say that something is true or not. And what I explained about publication bias in the pharmaceutical industry, which is they are very motivated, they should be motivated to publish positive evidence about pharmaceutical drugs. And the fact that they don't means that probably the drug is inefficient because they probably cannot publish these positive results. This is very, like a lot of philosophers of medicine would just say, and it's just plain, I don't know how to speak English anymore. Anyway, you understood. This is not controversial, that's what I mean. Okay. Now on the question of whether health professionals are aware of all of what I've told you, it's hard to say. And I think there is a need to do sociological studies to prove it. But I was able to, one way to think about a little bit more about these issues is, so in France, when you do medical school, you have to publish a thesis that is a little bit like a master thesis, but makes you a doctor. And you can do it in any disciplines. And so some doctors do it in sociology. And Justine Clocher in 2015, she studied how what doctors prescribe for pain relief during IUD insertion in France. And Spasfon is very, very, very often prescribed. It has been indeed prescribed to me in the past for that indication. And then she clearly was more evidence-based. And so she asked the doctors, why are you prescribing this? And these are some of their answers. I used to use homeopathy in the past, but well, so now I give Spasfon. I often give Spasfon. I don't know if that's helpful to prevent spasm or contraction. I don't know. It may be psychological. Some people give homeopathy, others, anyway. Another one say, I don't know if giving Spasfon reassures the patient as much as it reassures me, but it works out fine. And there is one doctor that says, for the little sweeties in pain, they will give ibuprofen, but for other people, they will just give Spasfon.
Sorry, is little sweeties idiomatic for something in French?
I did not translate it. It's a petite cocotte. Cocottes are little chickens.
Yeah.
What does it mean?
What does it mean? So the little chicks?
Little women?
It means the attractive ones, right?
No, it's just mean. It's like very. I don't know. It's like
kids.
Yeah, it's very infantilizing.
Is it infantilizing or referring to, or it's naivety? Okay, yeah.
It's like, oh, the little small women that are like, oh no, I'm in pain. I will give ibuprofen. And for the
So the ones who are not in pain were prescribed Spasfon.
well, yeah, that's what the person says. I don't know, maybe sweeties didn't work as a translation. I'm sorry, it doesn't. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to say, so maybe, so obviously some doctors know that the evidence is very low, but they prescribe it as a placebo, meaning they think that the placebo effect is worthwhile enough that it is okay to lie to a patient, which is not just French doctors, but in a lot of countries this has been shown. But also some doctors are not very clear. And again, they also talk about the spasm that seems to play a role in how they prescribe the drug. And then again, and this part was really important in the book and in the reception of the book as well, because some doctors will say, yeah, there is no medical evidence, but who cares? Like a little bit like the health authorities. It's not a big deal. And of course, I worked really hard to try to explain that this is not true. That prescribing massively a placebo that is probably not efficient for very painful things like menstrual pain and contraction during pregnancy or IUD insertion is actually a harm. There's also the financial aspect to it, is that it is a fact that France is using a lot of public money to fund this drug. There's also, I mean, when you decide to prescribe a drug that is probably not efficient, like it's just going to be a placebo effect, maybe, it's a little bit also a way to close off the patient-doctor relationship. It's like, oh, okay, you have this problem, take this and go away. So it's very efficient in ending the relationship and the medical problem. And also, in my view, it's also normalizing paternalism, so just lying in general in medicine, and also putting people, and in the case of Spasfon, it's going to be women, in a very removing power from people in the sense that they don't really know how medicine should work. They don't know about whether medicine needs evidence. They don't know that mechanistic evidence is not enough. They don't know there is no medical mechanistic evidence. So that's what I would call hermeneutical injustice. But I'm not focusing too much today on this. But it was, I had to focus a lot on this, on the public reception of the book after it was published. Because these are really not obvious for the French society and French doctors in general. Okay, so I did not tell you yet how I started researching all of this. So the starting point of this investigation was my own experience with Spasfon. And in a way, that's why the book and the research is a little bit what we would call standpoint epistemology. And indeed, no man has written a history of Spasfon before that I thought about it, which is surprising since it is like the top of the pharmaceutical chain in France. Okay, so what was this experience? Well, when I was a teenager, I told you already about it, but I was prescribed the drug because of menstrual pain. So it was just like, oh, I'm in pain, I have my period, I will take this. After a while though, in my 20s, I was not satisfied with the drug efficacy. I was like, this is actually not working. Probably it doesn't work on me. And I told medical practitioners, but it doesn't work, no? And they were like, like some, they say, yeah, no, it doesn't work. But some were not, like, maybe they were not sure. Okay. And so I had to tell the pharmacist, please don't give me this drug. I don't want to waste public money on this. Just don't give it to me. And then I experienced the experience of other women, because women talk to each other and they were like, oh, it also doesn't work on you. Oh, me too. And then we talked like this. And finally, at some point it clicked. Wait, I'm now a trained philosopher of medicine. Why am I not looking at the... Why am I... No, but you can imagine how powerful it is, like the cultural setting where you are, you're not able to say, oh, but no. So it took me a while, and I have the perfect archive of this moment. So it was in 2019. I said, I'm angry. You're in pain during your period. Take this useless drug. It comes in pink. Why? So I think it's interesting. It's not always that we can pinpoint where a project started. And for me, it was this. Why? Okay. And I'm going to show you now, when I say women talk to each other, I'm talking about a specific phenomenon, which is viral tweets or viral media content. So for instance, here, a woman tweeted, "Girls, do you remember?" And there's a crying emoji. So actually, I don't really know if it means anything. But anyway, it's clearly like a thing between girls. And then you have explicit tweets. This one I quote in my book. She says, "I've never seen a medicine as inefficient as Spasfon. You take 3 pills. It does not, nothing, brother." She agreed to be quoted in the book, so I put her anyway. And you can see that those are very viral tweets. Okay, Twitter used to be more viral, but this was already a lot. And another woman wrote, "Spasfon should be elected the most useless medicine in the world." Okay, so what happened after I published the book? So I tweeted about my book is going to be published next week, blah, blah, blah. And then it became viral, exactly like the tweets before that I showed you. And so it was a little bit crazy, but it went viral. Journalists, TV, everyone wanted to interview me before the publishing of the book. After the Huffington Post published one paper, then the local news also published newsflash. They mainly focused on "It Doesn't Work," which was not exactly the main point of my book, but they understood it's sexist, it doesn't work. And I've been told explicitly that's what they were selling to the I don't know, conference room where they decide what to write in any case. So without counting the news flashes, there was 6 newspaper articles, 10 interviews, print, online, 5 videos on the book of interviews of me directly. It interested the generalist media, like the main news, I don't know, The Guardian, for instance, were in France, the local media, but also the women press. So I gave twice an interview in Elle. I never thought as a philosopher I would do that. Cosmopolitan, in feminist media as well. But also it has been very well received by people in the medical community. So for instance, Prescrire is independent journal published by health professionals in France. It's really strict with Big Pharma, and they have 25,000 subscribers, health professionals. So they reviewed the book, they liked it, and last week they gave me actually their prize. So yeah. And of course I have also personal communication by medical doctors, but they like the book, okay. But one important thing is, it was really also, unsurprisingly, French women that really cared about this topic. So there was 29 article, book reviews, and so on. 22 of them were written, produced, and so on by women. The only politician that wrote directly about the topic was also women, because the government, well, because Macron, how do you say in English? Called for snap election or whatever it is.
So sexist.
He ended the ban, like I don't know, sorry, the technical legal vocabulary, but unfortunately the official question to the government on Spasfon has been put in the trash because Macron. Anyway, a comedian was the first to react. Elodie Arnoux, she made a very, very funny and viral video about Spasfon. And I think could be really interesting to study how humor can be used in this case. And also the gender pattern was also found in when my colleagues in university invited me to talk about the book. This is an exception because you don't know about that, right? But in France, it was also mostly women, gender studies group, feminist group, and so on.
The audience is more gender balanced than is typical in our department. So if you see any male colleagues who didn't make it to this one, let them know we use them as an example in the
So to say, it was even difficult to sell the book in the sense of convincing my publisher that it was a good idea. And this is a bit infuriating to me because it's the 5th most sold drug, but it's not important enough to write a book on. This is very frustrating, but it was hard work for me to convince that it would get interest, and it did get interest. Okay, so I read a lot of reaction from women, and mostly women again, about realizing that indeed the drugs had low numbers of clinical evidence. Okay. And I'm trying to summarize it, but it was things like, oh, so it was not just me. For me as well, for a long time, I thought, oh, it just doesn't work on me. So they said, I was not crazy. Like there's like a global gaslighting phenomenon where everybody is telling you this is the drug for you, and you're like, but wait, it doesn't work, am I crazy? And then they were like, oh, I didn't know. And the doctors did not have the same reaction. This is from patients. Many doctors were like, yes, of course we know, which is very infuriating again. There was a lot of humor, the same one I'm using sometimes in my talk. They said, but yes, I knew that it didn't work. All of my girlfriends agree that it doesn't work. And there was also a lot of testimony about how they had to suffer through many, many pains because they were prescribed this drug and nothing else, which is really upsetting to see that it was a big phenomenon. And the very frustrating feeling that if a medical doctor gives you Spasfon, it basically means they don't care about what your pain. And of course, there was a lot of anger. So I have a empirical project now in preparation. I'm waiting for ethical approval to actually study these reactions. Like I gave you a gist of what I remember and the hypothesis I have in the themes in this reaction, but I want to do an empirical survey. And I'm going to use the impact of the book to start, even though, of course, it's going to be biased by different ways that I cannot control. But there was, for instance, on my goal is to analyze 3,000 comments where people say their experience about the drug and whether it works or doesn't. But of course, I also want to do questionnaires that would be a bit less biased by the whole book, basically. And what I want to do is trying to understand what's the public perception of the drug, of Spasfon, and because it's not, like I said in the book, I say there is clearly some kind of epistemic injustice going on, but it's not very clear in the book what it is. And I think if I analyze all of these testimonies, then I can have a more empirical basis of what this injustice is. Which is, I think, well, this is hypothesis. I knew it didn't work, and yet I was not listened to, and I had a lot of pain as a result. Okay. So now I am reaching 1 hour, so I can stop here. I'll continue for a little bit more.
If it's a natural stopping point, then that'd be great. We can use that to questions.
Start this question and not continue.
By all means, leave us on some questions.
Okay. So, like I said in the beginning of the talk, I want to take seriously the fact that I don't think about myself, but I want to take seriously that the viral tweets that you saw I want to take seriously the fact that they knew something about the efficacy or like the lack of efficacy of the drug. And I want to try to define what kind of knowledge it is. How is it different from scientific knowledge? What kind of everyday knowledge it is, and so on. So I'm not going to show the rest of the slides now, and we can stop, but I'm going several ways. First, there's a literature on knowledge from absence, so I already mentioned it a little bit, but how do we create knowledge from the lack of something without committing a logical fallacy? There's a literature on this. A long time ago, I wrote my master dissertation on pain as a mental phenomenon. And what we know about pain is that you cannot make a mistake about whether you feel pain or not. I don't know if you're familiar with this. So basically, if I take Spasfon and I'm still in pain for a long time, well, I'm not mistaken about whether my pain is there or not. And so this is basically a very different question than to say that it's true that we need science to evaluate medical procedures and pharmaceuticals because we have a lot of cognitive bias that otherwise will make us believe that everything works, which leads me to another strange thing to me is that it should not be that a large part of the population believes that the Spasfon doesn't work. If we believe the huge literature in the philosophy of medicine, it's opposite that should happen. We have confirmation bias. We have all kinds of bias that all make us believe that a drug works. And that's why a long part of the history of medicine is all kind of weird, well, not weird, but inefficient medical practices. And yet, in the case of Spasfon, and maybe others, people do know, I want to take this seriously, they do know that it doesn't work. And it is surprising, and that's why I think there is also maybe a Bayesian argument to make, is that it's very unlikely that people arrive to the conclusion that it doesn't work, and this can tell us about whether likely or not it is that the drug works. And I will end there.